The U.S. Congress has passed its National Defense Bill for 2019 with tougher policies against Russia and China. Are we on the brink of a new Cold War? And just days after listing on the Nasdaq Stock Exchange, share prices of a Chinese e-commerce company plummeted. What went wrong and what lessons can be learned? Welcome to The Point, live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. The U.S. Congress has passed the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA, expanding the defense budget for next year up to $717 billion. Having passed the House of Representatives and the Senate, the bill is now on U.S. President Donald Trump's desk for signing. Consistent with the 2018 National Defense Strategy's focus on great power competition with Russia and China, the NDAA is proposing increasingly tough policies over the two countries. Provisions include, for instance, banning China from attending future joint maritime exercises in the Pacific known as RIMPAC, and barring the federal government and its contractors from using technologies produced by Chinese companies ZTE and Huawei. The bill also suggests strengthening military ties with Taiwan. So what specific policies have been introduced? What will be the implications on global security if these policies are carried out? Are we closer to a so-called new Cold War era? For more, I'm joined in the studio by Professor Zhang Junshe, Senior Captain and Vice President of the China Naval Research Institute. But before we start the discussion in response to the bill, Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson Geng Shuang urged the U.S. side to refrain from implementing the relevant clauses that would harm U.S.-China relations.
We urge the U.S. to discard the outdated Cold War and zero-sum mentality. Stop allowing a bill that contains negative China-related content to pass into law and refrain from implementing the relevant clauses, lest it should undermine the China-U.S. relations and the cooperation in key areas.
So China is strongly against it. Professor Zhang, let's break this bill down, especially the part that has to do with China. Basically, if you look at the document throughout various places, you see the word great power competition or competitors, Russia and China, repeatedly mentioned, and there is a specific paragraph dedicated to China, and it starts with prohibiting any U.S. government agency from using risky technology produced by Huawei or ZTE, saying the two companies are linked to the Chinese Communist Party's intelligence apparatus, and also prohibits any entity doing business with the U.S. government from using Huawei or ZTE technology. What are the considerations to your understanding of such a clause, and what is behind such a clause?
Well, the U.S. gave the reason to prohibiting the exchanges between the U.S. companies and the Chinese companies. The reason is the so-called national security reason, but I don't think it's the true reason. I think the minds of the U.S. decision makers are full of Cold War mentality and zero-sum game mentality, and they have actually regarded China as the main threat to the U.S. national security, and this can be seen from the U.S. National Security Strategy released last year, and also the National Defense Strategy early this year.
Do we have any evidence, any proved evidence that ZTE or Huawei are a threat to the national security of the United States, and that they actually carry out certain functions as part of the Chinese government apparatus?
No. I don't think they have any evidence that can prove that these Chinese companies are conducting intelligence operations. On the other hand, we can see that many Chinese are using the Apple cell phones. So we don't.
I for one.
Yes. So I don't think how our American friends think about this. So if the Chinese act like as the U.S. decision makers do, so what will be the Apple companies and other companies that are selling their products in China?
Another thing here, it says the bill directs a whole-of-government strategy on China to address the Chinese Communist Party's use of political influence, economic tools, cyber activities, global infrastructure and development projects, and military activities against the United States and allies and partners. What does it mean, a whole-of-government strategy, and what does that say about the level of alert that the U.S. has taken on against China?
Well, I think they have regarded China as an enemy, actually, to the United States. So they are actually making an enemy out of China. So I think this is a very sad thing, because we can see that actually many U.S. or more U.S. products, including the cultural products, are being sold to China, much more than that being sold in the United States by the Chinese side. So they are just making an excuse to expel the Chinese products from the U.S. market. They want to actually, we can see that actually this type of trade protectionism. They want to clean their market from the Chinese products. I think this is not fair to the Chinese companies and economy.
One thing that needs to be said is that this bill has passed through the House of Representatives and the Senate, both by overwhelming majority with very little resistance or opposition. So does that mean this kind of mentality or ideology against China is really quite a unanimous view of many lawmakers in the United States?
Yes, we can see that many lawmakers now in the United States may regard China as an actual threat to the United States. But also we can see from this Defense Authorization Act that the budget, the defense budget has been going very high. It has made a record high. And this may be because the military-industrial complex, which is composed by the U.S. military and the defense industry and the lawmakers, that was regarded as a monster in the United States by the former president of the United States, Mr. Eisenhower. So I think they are actually making an enemy, and then they can make some policies to expel China from their market. I think first is because of the America First policy adopted by the President of the United States. And second, I think actually they want to, and we have seen that many Americans seen that after 30 years of reform and opening up, that China haven't or hasn't followed the U.S. model of development. Mm-hmm. So many Americans were not satisfied with the development. So they want to now to use all means to contain China's development, and they want to keep the American yes.
As a dominant power and
yes.
the only dominant power. Okay, more provisions here targeting China. For instance, the bill requires the Secretary of Defense to submit a 5-year plan for an Indo-Pacific Stability Initiative, and it also talks about a strategy with specific benchmarks toward enhancing India's status as major defense partner and defense and security cooperation with India under the big subtitle dedicated to China. Is the U.S. thinking of, taking India by the hand in their effort to contain China? What would be the reaction from India, do we know?
Yes, we can see that from November last year that actually the Trump administration is adopting the so-called Indo-Pacific strategy. And we have seen that they have changed the name of the Pacific Command of the U.S. military to the Indo-Pacific mm-hmm. Command. And also recently they changed the name of the Southeast Asia Maritime Security Initiative to the Indo-Pacific Maritime Security Initiative. They want to include India in their new strategy, which is aimed mainly at containing China's
What's India's view here?
But India, we can see that has reacted very much differently from what the United States want them to do. We can see that from the speech made by the Prime Minister of India, Mr. Modi, at the Shangri-La dialogue in early
the Shangri-La dialogue,
he stressed cooperation with China instead of containing China. I think this is somewhat disappointed to the U.S. decision makers.
Okay. I'm joined on the line. I'm told that I'm joined on the line by Mr. Ivan Eland, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center on Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. Mr. Eland, thank you very much for joining us. I want to ask you questions concerning one provision which talks about increasing the U.S.'s defense exchanges with Taiwan. It talks about the bill supporting improving Taiwan's capabilities and enhancing senior level military-to-military engagements. However, the U.S. Secretary of State, Mr. Pompeo, just said very recently, just told Chinese State Councilor and top diplomat Wang Yi that the United States adheres to the One China policy and its position remains unchanged. Why does the United States say one thing and do another?
Well, the United States has always differed on whether that meant, the One China policy meant aiding Taiwan. I think back in the Jimmy Carter days, they, went with diplomatic relations with China and discontinued them with Taiwan, but that didn't mean that they weren't going to aid Taiwan, and they have done so by selling weapons and having these, possibly by having these increased military exchanges, etc. So there's been a lot of help to the Taiwanese defense forces.
How do you look at the toughened attitudes and policies against Russia and China? Do you think it is really, as what Professor Zhang has said, making China an enemy, making an enemy out of China more than it is necessary, because China is stressing a peaceful rise, stressing cooperation on all fronts?
Well, I think the Defense Department has reoriented, but then they get distracted by the Middle Eastern wars. So, Barack Obama was trying to pivot to Asia as to contain China, and I think Trump is even more so. I think he has some affinity for Russia, but not much for China, particularly in the trade area. But his administration, as you point out, has gone more hardline on the China and Russia. The Defense Department has altered its strategy to be less inclined to battle terrorism and more with China and Russia in mind, as far as not fighting them but preparing to fight for them. And I think my own view is that I think China should be allowed to have a peaceful rise, and certainly China wants more influence in its region, as all great powers have done since the beginning of time. And I think, we probably should take the model as the U.S. rise, and the British Empire allowed the U.S. to rise peacefully, and I think that model could be used in China's case as well.
Okay, we have to leave it there. Mr. Eland, Senior Fellow and the Director of the Center on Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. One last question back to my guest here in the studio, Professor Zhang Junshe. Now, the United States have this defense bill very clearly targeting China. Professor Zhang, how is that going to change China's defense policy, because China obliged to increase its defense spending, to invest more in lethal weapons, to enlarge its capacity and capabilities? What is going to be China's response?
Well, I think China will still adhere to the national defense policy, which is defensive in nature, and will carry out the active defense military strategy, and will not carry out any arms race with any country, including the United States. We will absolutely strengthen our defense capabilities, which will be defensive to guard against the foreign invasions, just like that have happened in history against China. So I don't think our policy will be so provocative as the United States.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Zhang Junshe, Senior Captain and Vice President of the China Naval Research Institute. And you have been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll take a short break, and when I come back, I'll be hearing how one of the largest Chinese tech stocks plummeted just days after its successful launch on NASDAQ. Stay with us. A number of big Chinese tech companies have seen their share prices slide sharply in the past few weeks. In particular, Chinese online bulk product discounter Pinduoduo, the fastest growing application in the history of the Chinese internet, has been told to intensify its management over shop owners and verify that products sold on its site are authentic. The online group discounter has been investigated over allegations of counterfeit goods being traded on its platform rather, and investors are not happy. Just days after going public in the US, Pinduoduo's share price tumbled by 16%, falling below its IPO price of $19 and wiping out over $9 billion in value, although the share price has since then crept back up to 19. The drop was in part initiated by requests made by a television maker to remove counterfeit listings of its products. Pinduoduo has since revealed that it has removed over 10 million listings of problematic goods. So how big a problem is there with the sale of counterfeit goods on e-commerce sites generally? Why did Pinduoduo get targeted in this way, and what has been the fallout for other tech companies? Joining me in the studio here is Professor Haijun from the Law School of Renmin University, and from New Jersey, Scott Schober, CEO of Berkeley Varitronics system. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Professor Jing, let me go to you first. Now, for our viewers who have little idea about what Pinduoduo is, actually, for me also, I only got to know about Pinduoduo just days ago because it has basically sprung up. What makes Pinduoduo the fastest growing internet e-commerce company? In 3 years, they attracted over 300 million users.
Yes, that's also very interesting for me because I know Pinduoduo maybe just 1 year ago when I watched a TV program in Shanghai. It advertised this Pinduoduo. Then I know this news just recently that it's go public in New York, and also they invite many bad news that, as you said. So I think why Pinduoduo can get success in so short period. One thing that it's combining of social media and e-commerce. That means it can invite so many people according to like Tencent or other social media. The other thing that the price is so cheap. So that's generally the nature of the thing that the cheaper, the more welcome. So I think that's the one, some reasons to explain why it's success.
Yeah, well, we are also joined by Thomas Luo, co-founder and CEO of PingWest. Welcome, Mr. Luo. Let me go to Mr. Luo then. A senior official with the State Administration for Market Regulation in China has said that conniving at or even supporting the sale of counterfeit products is a legal red line that no online shopping platform can cross. Where did Pinduoduo go wrong? Has it been unlucky? Has it acted fraudulently, or is it a problem affecting all e-commerce companies?
Well, I think if you talk about this question 5 or 6 years ago, and we have to say at that time it was the problem that each e-commerce platform had to face with in China. But now I think things have been changed a lot, because during the past years, if you see what Taobao or what JD.com has been done in for just overcome this kind of the fraud products or this kind of the poor quality product issues, and they really made a lot on that. Now in Taobao and they just encourage the individual designers or the individual product brand providers just to do some kind of things on that, just instead of the tolerate the fraud products or the sort of things. And I think that's the very significant change during the past years. But for Pinduoduo, I think it's a little bit different from that, because if you use Taobao or JD.com or these sort of things, and I think they just cover the first 100 million or 200 million users in China, but Pinduoduo just discovered the rest of part of the world, the rest of part of the users, I think. So they just got over 300 million users, and they may not be the users on JD or Taobao, I think. So they just discovered a new market, and this market in which the previous problem that Taobao or JD.com once suffered.
Okay, so maybe it's a matter of time. Are you suggesting that you know, Pinduoduo is plagued with counterfeiting? But we'll talk about that in just a moment. Let me go to Mr. Schober. 7 U.S. law firms have launched investigations into Pinduoduo on behalf of their investors. The statement issued by the firms show that investors suffered financial losses after Chinese regulators began looking into the company's dealings. Let's not forget that the company only got listed at the end of July, and you know, everything is still fresh here. So, Mr. Schober, do these investors have a case here?
Yeah, well, actually, they may have a case. If you think about it, whether they win or lose, it actually could be catastrophic. Why? Because what happens when you get tied up into legal proceedings, it could do a lot of damage to a company, especially a company as this just recently listed. What about the brand? What about the shareholders? What about the investors? All of these things can have long impacting effects on a corporation and certainly their bottom line if they don't fix their fundamental problem, which I believe their fundamental problem is really the quality. There's so many reports again and again about counterfeit goods, about poor quality, that it sends a message to the consumers. And it doesn't matter if it's affluent consumers, or in this case, it's more a lower-end consumer that are paying very low rock-bottom prices. If the quality is not there, there'll continue to be lawsuits, there'll continue to be problems, and the brand will be affected. So they really need to do damage control right here and right now to improve that.
Yeah, okay.
They're not alone. Over the years, other e-commerce platforms have the same problem.
Yeah, Mr. Jing, Professor Jing, how do you look at the problem Pinduoduo is faced here? Is it because of low quality? Is it because of counterfeiting? Exactly, what's the problem? And we know that Pinduoduo is targeting the lower-end market in the 3rd, 4th tier cities in China. So that's why it flourished, right? People want to get a good bargain out of such an application because you can buy things in bulk. But also the complaint rate is also very high. 17% of users complain, and the user satisfaction rating is only a 1-star, but these information should be clear to the investors before it went public, right? So what is the problem here?
Sure. As to the disclose of this information, I think that all of these should be public before they go public, and the investors will, you know, get lost if such information, important information, has not been disclosed. But it depends on the evidence. Then the second thing I wanted to say that the counterfeiting goods, it's still, we needed these statistics to see, is that so many counterfeiting goods, or is it a general phenomenon on this website? If not, Pinduoduo is just like a Taobao. It's just the online service provider. So from the legal point, there's still kind of defense for Pinduoduo, because according to the Chinese law, or even the law in the United States, the OSP can, you know, argue that there's no ability for the OSP to control or to monitoring all kind of dealings, because they're just the platform, and we needed more details and evidence to say on this point.
Yeah, well, you have to understand, I think people have to understand the sheer volume of transactions and the number of sellers and transactions that are taking place on such platform on a daily basis. It's basically impossible, I think, for anybody to survey and to make sure that, you know, there are no counterfeit products. I can understand that kind of challenge. But Mr. Luo, going back to you, we're not just talking about Pinduoduo's shares going down. we're talking about many other tech companies, as I mentioned at the beginning of the program, Tencent, Baidu, and which is a Chinese search engine, and then Bilibili, a video streaming company that have all experienced fluctuations. What is the problem here? Are tech companies jinxed?
Yeah, this is a very great question. Because we just noticed, and there has been a trend that this kind of the stock price just went down or this sort of things. But I think it depends on different sort of situations. And for Tencent or for Baidu, I think the main reason was in their core business. For Tencent, is the revenue from games, and for Baidu is the advertisement from search. I think for Tencent and Baidu, the main problem should be the core business for them cannot achieve that kind of the rapid growth as before. So I think that should be the problem. But for other sort of the companies like Bilibili or this sort of things, I think they're still in the sort of like the immature situation to face with the regulations or to face with the new coming problems and in terms of their products or different sort of things. But generally, I think it's really not the best time for the Chinese companies to do a lot of things. But I think one of the way to make sense and to achieve the rapid growth or to achieve the continued growth is to expand the overseas market to see what we can do, what this company can do in global market.
Okay. Okay. Mr. Schober, very, very briefly, 10 seconds maybe. Is there a lesson to learn here for Chinese tech companies going abroad?
Well, certainly as competition grows, they have to focus, I think, on their core. You look at Tencent, and they've been on a spending spree lately, if you contrast it to others. So when they spend a lot of money, what happens? You get distracted. Focus on your core, focus on growing abroad and your customer base, and of course, again, quality, get the counterfeit out of there. That's going to be key for their growth long term.
Okay, thank you very much. We have to leave it there. Thomas Law, co-founder and CEO of PingWest, Scott Schober, CEO of Berkeley Varitronics Systems, and Professor Haijun from the Law School of Renmin University. And that is it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with Alex. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.